The year was 1940, and Britain stood on the precipice of defeat. The Nazi war machine had swept across Europe, leaving devastation in its wake. Only Britain remained, stubbornly clinging to its island shores, with Winston Churchill standing as its resolute leader. The Luftwaffe had relentlessly bombed London and other major cities in the Blitz, but still the British spirit endured. Yet, as the war raged on, a question loomed: how could Britain survive without the overwhelming strength of its army or the resources needed to mount an effective counterattack? The solution, however, would not be found in the traditional arsenal of military might. It would come from a secret pact, one that would bind Churchill's government in ways that history would later reveal as both a lifeline and a moral compromise. The deal was forged out of sheer necessity. Britain had always relied on its empire for resources, but now that empire was stretched thin, its colonies vulnerable to the expanding Axis powers. To keep the war effort alive, Churchill turned to the United States, a country that had yet to officially join the conflict. The British government knew that to sustain its fight, it needed not only supplies but strategic support. The United States, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, was hesitant to fully commit, especially given the isolationist sentiments prevailing in Congress. But the two leaders shared a common vision: the defeat of Nazi Germany. Behind closed doors, they worked out a deal that would ultimately change the course of the war. This was not a diplomatic exchange of favors, but rather a life-or-death arrangement. The deal, known later as the Lend-Lease Act, would allow Britain to receive military aid in the form of arms, food, and supplies without immediate payment. This was a bold move, one that would allow Britain to continue its fight against Germany without the crippling financial strain of purchasing weapons up front. In exchange, Britain would offer America the use of its military bases across the empire, as well as valuable intelligence on the enemy's movements. The agreement was pivotal for Churchill, whose government was running low on resources and morale. The British economy was struggling under the weight of the war, and Churchill knew that this secret pact with Roosevelt was the key to survival. But the implications of the deal were far-reaching. Roosevelt, despite his strong desire to support Britain, was walking a tightrope. He had to convince Congress, the American people, and his own advisors that aiding Britain was not just a noble cause, but a strategic necessity. For Roosevelt, this was not merely an act of charity. It was a calculated move to strengthen the Allied front and, by extension, safeguard American interests. The United States was still technically neutral, but Roosevelt understood that without Britain, the Axis would be free to conquer all of Europe and eventually turn its sights on the Western Hemisphere. He knew that a Nazi victory would leave the world at the mercy of totalitarianism. The Lend-Lease Agreement was shrouded in secrecy, and its full ramifications would not be known to the public for years. For Churchill, it was a godsend. Without it, the war might have ended differently. With it, Britain could continue to hold its ground. The deal would provide not only the necessary supplies but also the moral boost that Britain needed. However, as time would tell, the arrangement was not without its complexities. For one, the deal tied Britain even closer to the United States, placing its future in the hands of another nation. Additionally, the pact was not just about military aid, it was also about power. Roosevelt knew that with this arrangement, the United States would gain a significant foothold in Britain's colonies and across the world. As the deal unfolded, it would become clear that the United States had more to gain than simply the defeat of Nazi Germany. The agreement between Roosevelt and Churchill was not just a strategic maneuver, but a necessary step to ensure the survival of Britain in a world dominated by fascism. The British Empire, once the greatest in the world, was now a shadow of its former self, reeling from the effects of the Great Depression and the ongoing war. Churchill, in his determination to keep Britain fighting, found himself forced to make concessions that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. For one, the Lend-Lease Act tied Britain to the American war effort in ways that would have profound consequences for the post-war world order. As the deal began to take shape, it became clear that Britain's survival depended on more than just the provision of arms and supplies. Churchill knew that he had to maintain the goodwill of Roosevelt and the American people. This meant that Britain would have to make sacrifices, both politically and militarily. The most significant of these was the relinquishing of control over strategic military bases in the British Empire. Roosevelt's request for access to British-controlled territories, including bases in the Caribbean and in Africa, was seen as a direct challenge to British sovereignty. But Churchill, with his pragmatic vision, saw no alternative. The survival of Britain and the defeat of Germany outweighed any concerns over the loss of imperial control. What made the deal particularly controversial was the secrecy surrounding it. Both Roosevelt and Churchill understood that public knowledge of the Lend-Lease Act would stir up immense opposition. In the United States, isolationist sentiment was strong, and any overt military alliance with Britain would be seen as a violation of America's neutral stance. In Britain, the public was already weary of war, and any hint of further dependence on foreign powers could undermine morale. Therefore, the agreement was kept behind closed doors, with only a few key figures privy to its details. This secrecy created a sense of distrust between the two nations, even as they worked together toward a common goal. The terms of the Lend-Lease Act also included a provision that would have far-reaching consequences for the British economy. In exchange for the military aid, Britain was expected to make payments over time, payments that, in many cases, would never be fully made. The idea was that the United States would provide aid to Britain with the expectation that the debt would be settled after the war, but given Britain's economic plight, it seemed unlikely that the country would ever be able to repay its obligations in full. The deal, then, was not just a matter of military assistance. It was also a financial lifeline for a country on the brink of collapse. For Britain, the Lend-Lease Agreement was a double-edged sword. While it provided the necessary resources to continue fighting, it also deepened the nation's financial dependence on the United States. The British government, already burdened with wartime expenditures, now found itself locked into a system of debt that would shape its post-war recovery. Moreover, the United States, through the deal, had effectively become Britain's most powerful ally, and this created a new power dynamic. The British Empire, once the unchallenged ruler of vast territories, was now dependent on a rising global superpower. The deal also marked a turning point in the relationship between the two nations. Before the war, Britain and the United States had been allies, but they had also been rivals. The Lend-Lease Act, however, cemented their partnership, creating an alliance that would shape the course of the war and the post-war world order. It was not just a military alliance, but a political and economic one that would eventually lead to the creation of NATO and the establishment of the United States as the dominant global power. The agreement's consequences were not limited to Britain and the United States alone. Across the world, the deal would have ripple effects, affecting colonial territories, foreign policy, and even the post-war division of Europe. As Britain became more reliant on the United States, its global influence began to wane. In the years that followed, many of Britain's colonies would gain independence, and the British Empire would fade into history. The Lend-Lease deal, in many ways, marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, an era dominated by American power and influence. As the Lend-Lease Act began to take effect, the repercussions of the deal spread far beyond the British Isles. In Europe, the shift in power dynamics was palpable. The United States, through its support of Britain, was now deeply embedded in the Allied war effort, and its economic and military influence would continue to grow. The Soviet Union, still reeling from its brutal conflict with Nazi Germany, watched with increasing apprehension as the United States strengthened its ties to Britain. For Joseph Stalin, the prospect of a dominant Anglo-American alliance was both a relief and a threat. The United States' entry into the war had helped turn the tide against Hitler, but Stalin feared that Roosevelt and Churchill might form a post-war alliance that excluded the Soviet Union. In the Pacific, the effects of the deal were equally profound. Japan, already in conflict with China and seeking to expand its empire, now found itself facing a formidable Allied coalition. The United States, with its vast industrial resources, was able to provide support to China and the other Pacific nations resisting Japan's advances. But as the war in the Pacific escalated, so too did tensions between the United States and Japan, culminating in the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The Lend-Lease Act, by drawing the United States deeper into the war, had set in motion a series of events that would lead to Japan's defeat, and to the ultimate transformation of the United States into the world's preeminent superpower. The economic implications of the deal were also far-reaching. For the United States, the Lend-Lease Act marked a shift from isolationism to global involvement. It was not just about providing arms and supplies to Britain. It was about building a new international economic order. The United States, through the provision of aid to Britain and other allied nations, became the lender and supplier to the world. The post-war world would be shaped by American economic dominance, and the Lend-Lease Act was the first step in this new era of global power. But for Britain, the deal was a mixed blessing. While it allowed the country to continue its fight against Nazi Germany, it also placed Britain in a precarious position. The country was now financially indebted to the United States, and this debt would only grow in the coming years. Moreover, the deal had made Britain increasingly reliant on the United States for military and economic support. As the war progressed, Churchill began to realize that the very survival of Britain's empire might depend on how well it could navigate its relationship with the rising superpower across the Atlantic. The Lend-Lease Act also had significant consequences for the post-war political landscape. As the war neared its end, Churchill began to worry about the future of Britain's empire and its place in the New World Order. The United States, with its enormous economic power, would soon dominate the global stage, and Britain would have to find a way to maintain its influence in a rapidly changing world. The Lend-Lease Act in many ways had laid the groundwork for this transformation. The agreement between Britain and the United States had created an interdependence that would continue to shape global politics long after the war ended. The most immediate impact of the Lend-Lease Act, however, was on the battlefield. As the war in Europe reached its climax, the assistance provided by the United States became increasingly crucial. The weapons, supplies, and logistical support that Britain received through the deal were instrumental in maintaining the Allied war effort. Without the resources provided by the United States, Britain might not have been able to continue its fight against Nazi Germany. The success of the D-Day invasion in June 1944, which marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's Third Reich, was made possible by the military aid supplied under the Lend-Lease Act. As the war stretched on, the immense burden of the Lend-Lease Agreement began to weigh heavily on the conscience of Britain's leadership. The deal had given Britain the lifeline it desperately needed to continue the fight against Nazi Germany, but it also came with a moral cost that was not immediately apparent. For Churchill, the deal represented a necessary evil, a compromise with a global power that would soon eclipse Britain's own influence. Yet even in the midst of triumph, there lingered a quiet, gnawing sense of guilt. The moral dilemma was not only about the financial debt Britain was accruing to the United States, but about the profound shift in the balance of power that the agreement had set in motion. At the core of this dilemma was Britain's position in the world. Churchill's government had long prided itself on the strength of the British Empire, the far-reaching influence it wielded across the globe. Yet, the Lend-Lease deal signified a stark departure from Britain's traditional self-reliance. By accepting aid, Britain was tethering itself to a foreign power that had not only emerged as a major economic and military force but was also poised to reshape the post-war world order. The empire, which had once been the envy of nations, was now entering a phase of decline, with the United States steadily positioning itself as the world's new leader. The moral cost of this shift was not lost on Churchill. How could he reconcile the survival of Britain with the reality of its diminishing stature on the world stage? Moreover, the Lend-Lease Act created an uncomfortable dependence on the United States that would persist long after the war had ended. Britain's access to crucial supplies and weaponry had become entwined with its relationship with Roosevelt. But what if the United States decided to pull back its support after the war? What would become of Britain's ability to maintain its empire, its military prowess, and its global influence? The United States, after all, was not just a benefactor, it was also a rising superpower with its own ambitions. The more Britain accepted American aid, the more it risked losing control over its destiny, becoming a subordinate ally rather than an equal partner in the post-war order. There was also the delicate matter of the empire itself. The Lend-Lease Act was not just about military assistance. It was a geopolitical maneuver that gave the United States strategic access to British territories. As Roosevelt secured bases in the Caribbean and Africa, Britain's global power was increasingly constrained by the needs of its American partner. Churchill had been forced to cede control over these territories to ensure British survival, but this sacrifice came at a cost. The United States, with its vast resources and military might, was now in a position to dictate terms in regions that had long been British domains. While the immediate survival of Britain was paramount, the long-term implications of this arrangement were not lost on Churchill. How much longer could Britain maintain its imperial legacy if it was continually indebted to another nation? Even the act of accepting Lend-Lease aid carried with it a psychological toll. For Churchill, the idea of asking for help was deeply unsettling. Britain's political culture, with its emphasis on self-sufficiency and independence, did not easily accommodate the notion of relying on a foreign power for survival. The British public had always taken pride in their country's resilience, and now they were being asked to put their faith in the United States. While many in Britain viewed the deal as a necessary evil, others saw it as a betrayal of the country's proud history. For a nation that had prided itself on its global dominance, the dependence on the United States was a bitter pill to swallow. It was a symbol of the changing world order, one in which Britain no longer stood at the center. Yet, despite the moral reservations, the pragmatic necessity of the deal could not be ignored. The war was a fight for survival, and Britain could not afford to let ideology or national pride stand in the way of its continued existence. Churchill, ever the strategist, understood that without American aid, Britain's ability to resist the Axis powers would be significantly weakened. The choice was simple: accept the aid and fight for survival or risk losing everything. The Lend-Lease Act, in its essence, was not just a strategic military maneuver, it was a stark reminder of the lengths to which a nation will go to preserve its way of life. In many ways, the moral dilemma of the Lend-Lease deal was emblematic of the broader struggle Britain faced during the war. Every decision, every alliance, was made with the knowledge that the war was not just about defeating the enemy, it was about safeguarding Britain's very existence. The decisions made in those secret meetings between Churchill and Roosevelt, often conducted behind closed doors, reflected the gravity of this reality. Churchill had no illusions about the cost of the deal, but he knew that in the end, the survival of Britain was the ultimate priority. The moral dilemmas would have to wait, at least until the war was won. In retrospect, the moral complexity of the Lend-Lease Act was only fully appreciated after the war ended. For Britain, the immediate crisis was over, but the long-term consequences of the deal became clearer with time. The debt to the United States, both financial and political, would linger for decades, shaping the trajectory of British foreign policy and its place in the global order. The post-war world was defined by the rise of two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain, once the dominant force on the world stage, found itself increasingly sidelined, its empire crumbling and its influence waning. The Lend-Lease deal had ensured Britain's survival during the war, but it had also set the stage for the post-war decline of the British Empire. For Churchill, the choice to accept the aid was one of necessity. Yet, the moral implications of that decision would haunt the nation for years to come. Despite the emotional and moral toll of the decision, Churchill's leadership in forging the Lend-Lease deal was a testament to his understanding of the war's high stakes. The man who had once declared that Britain would never surrender now embraced a new reality, that survival often requires compromise. In the end, the Lend-Lease Act was a lifeline, one that allowed Britain to continue its fight against the Axis powers. Yet, it was also a reminder of the fragile balance between national pride and the harsh realities of war. Churchill had made a choice that would secure Britain's survival, but in doing so, he had accepted a new world order, a world where Britain's place at the top was no longer guaranteed. As the war raged on, the implications of the Lend-Lease deal began to ripple across the globe, reshaping the international order in ways that would prove irreversible. The global balance of power was undergoing a profound transformation. The United States, previously an isolated power, was now firmly entrenched as a dominant military and economic force. Its economic prowess, bolstered by the unprecedented scale of industrial production required for the war effort, was beginning to eclipse that of all other nations. In contrast, Britain, once the undisputed leader of the world's largest empire, found itself struggling to maintain its global influence. The very empire that had once sustained Britain's power was now rapidly deteriorating, its colonial territories exposed to new forces, including rising nationalist movements and the undeniable fact that Britain's military and financial resources had been drained by years of war. The end of the war would mark the beginning of a new era. While Britain had once been the beating heart of a global empire that spanned continents, its post-war future was now uncertain. The Lend-Lease deal, with its implicit financial and strategic costs, had highlighted the diminishing power of Britain on the world stage. No longer could Britain act as a lone superpower. Its future survival and influence would increasingly depend on the cooperation and goodwill of the United States. The geopolitical center of gravity was shifting westward, as the United States emerged not only as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere but as a global leader with unrivaled economic resources and military capabilities. The consequences of the Lend-Lease agreement were felt most acutely in the colonies. Britain had long relied on the economic output of its empire to fuel its global power, but the post-war era ushered in an age of decolonization. As European powers, particularly Britain and France, were weakened by the war, colonies around the world began to demand independence. The United States, having emerged from the war relatively unscathed and with a vast industrial capacity, played a key role in supporting decolonization efforts. Its foreign policy, embodied in the concept of self-determination, provided the ideological foundation for many of these independence movements. While Britain had long controlled vast swathes of territory in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, the aftermath of the war revealed that these colonies could no longer be held in check by military force alone. The rise of the United States also brought with it a new economic reality. The Lend-Lease agreement had been essential for Britain's survival during the war, but it had come at a cost. The United States' financial and industrial might was now fully on display, and Britain, with its economy in tatters, found itself unable to compete. The war had left Britain deeply indebted to the United States, and this debt would loom over the nation for years to come. Britain, once the world's economic powerhouse, was now financially dependent on the very country that had once been its ally. In the aftermath of the war, Britain faced not only the challenge of rebuilding its shattered economy but also the reality that it could no longer maintain the lavish spending of the imperial age. For Churchill, this was a moment of profound reflection. As Prime Minister, he had fought to preserve Britain's global influence, but in the face of economic reality, he knew that Britain could no longer maintain its imperial ambitions. The Lend-Lease deal had allowed Britain to survive the war, but it had also highlighted the unsustainable nature of the empire. The post-war world would be defined by the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union, both of which would vie for global supremacy. Britain's place in this new order was uncertain, and Churchill's vision of a united and powerful Britain was rapidly becoming a relic of the past. The United States, in contrast, had emerged from the war with a new sense of purpose and ambition. The economic resources at its disposal were staggering, and its military might was unmatched. The world was now looking to Washington, not London, for leadership. The Lend-Lease Act had played a significant role in cementing the United States' position as the world's preeminent power. It was not just a symbol of American generosity, it was a reflection of the United States' broader geopolitical strategy. By providing aid to Britain and the other allied nations, the United States ensured that it would be at the center of the post-war world order. The Lend-Lease Act was in many ways the precursor to the Marshall Plan, which would later provide aid to rebuild war-torn Europe and further cement the United States' role as the leader of the Western world. In the years following the war, the world would be divided into two spheres of influence, one dominated by the United States and the other by the Soviet Union. Britain, weakened by the war and its reliance on American aid, was no longer a global superpower. The British Empire, once the largest in history, began to disintegrate, and the colonies that had once been the backbone of British power gained independence. For Churchill, this was the ultimate tragedy. The Lend-Lease Agreement had been necessary for Britain's survival, but it had come at a high cost, one that Britain would pay in terms of its global standing and its imperial legacy. As Britain grappled with these realities, it became clear that the post-war world would be shaped by the new superpowers, and Britain's role would be relegated to that of a junior partner in the American-led global order. The Lend-Lease deal, which had been a lifeline during the war, had also been a harbinger of the new world order. A world where the United States, not Britain, would hold the reins of power. The effects of this shift would be felt for decades, as Britain adjusted to its new place in the world. In the end, the Lend-Lease deal was both a triumph and a tragedy for Britain. It secured the country's survival during the war and enabled the Allies to defeat Nazi Germany, but it also marked the beginning of the end for Britain's imperial ambitions. The deal had allowed Britain to continue its fight, but it had also set the stage for a world where British influence was diminished, and the United States would assume the mantle of global leadership. For Churchill, the price of survival was the loss of an empire, and the future of Britain would be forever shaped by the consequences of the secret deal he had made to keep the nation fighting. The full scale of the Lend-Lease Act's impact on the war effort in Britain became increasingly clear as 1941 and 1942 unfolded. The infusion of American supplies did not just bolster Britain's military capacity, it transformed the strategic landscape. Initially, the war had been one of endurance. Britain was fighting a defensive battle against a seemingly unstoppable force, relying on its resources and the few remaining allies to hold the line. The German army, having swept across France and much of Europe, had the full might of its military-industrial complex at its disposal. Britain, by contrast, had to keep a fragile grip on its empire and war machine, all while fending off German air raids and naval blockades. But the arrival of American material changed this dynamic in ways both tangible and intangible. One of the most immediate impacts of Lend-Lease was the transformation of Britain's ability to replenish its weapons and supplies. The British Royal Air Force, RAF, which had been battered during the Battle of Britain and struggled to keep pace with German production, suddenly had access to a wealth of new aircraft. American bombers, including the B-17 Flying Fortress, provided crucial reinforcements. With these new planes, Britain could strike deeper into German-occupied Europe, forcing the Nazis to divert their resources to defend against Allied air raids. Meanwhile, British naval forces received crucial supplies of American-built ships, including destroyers and other vital technologies to counter the relentless U-boat threat in the Atlantic. These new resources, which flooded into Britain through the Lend-Lease channels, helped tip the balance in the Allies' favor, providing Britain with the tools it needed to hold the line and then go on the offensive. The supplies came at a critical moment. As Britain faced the looming possibility of a German invasion, one that would have dealt a fatal blow to its sovereignty, the arrival of American material assistance proved to be a game-changer. The British Army, struggling to fight a war on multiple fronts and facing extreme shortages in both men and equipment, found its position considerably bolstered. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, and artillery pieces, all produced in the vast American factories, poured into the British war machine. Yet, despite these advantages, Churchill could not help but feel the heavy cost of the deal. While Britain could continue to push the Nazis back, the country's future was becoming increasingly dependent on its American ally. However, the flow of American aid did not come without its complications. With every convoy that brought fresh tanks, planes, and ammunition, Britain's sovereignty seemed to fade. The nation's military decisions were increasingly guided by the availability of American equipment, and British leaders were forced to defer more often to their American counterparts. As Britain relied on American resources to fight its battles, it became clear that a shift in power was occurring. While Churchill's resolve to defend Britain remained unshaken, the very resources that sustained this fight were coming from a foreign source, a reality that deepened the nation's dependency on the United States. The deal, while invaluable in its immediate survival benefits, planted the seeds of Britain's eventual political and economic decline. By the end of the war, Britain's debt to the United States would be a heavy burden, one that would shape British foreign policy for generations. The Lend-Lease Act, however, was not only about tanks and bombers, it also shaped Britain's strategic planning. American intelligence, which was quickly becoming world-class, played a pivotal role in bolstering British defenses. British and American intelligence agencies began to work closely together, sharing critical information on German movements, technological advancements, and operational plans. The Americans' ability to break German codes, combined with British expertise in signals intelligence, gave the Allies an edge in their military campaigns. The success of the D-Day invasion, for instance, was largely due to the timely and accurate intelligence supplied by this transatlantic cooperation. Lend-Lease thus created a strategic partnership that went beyond weapons and supplies, embedding American influence into every layer of Britain's war effort. By mid-1942, Britain had entered a new phase of the war, one in which the Americans' industrial might was clearly on display. While Britain was stretched thin with multiple fronts and an ever-growing debt, it could now rely on its American ally to offset these challenges. The influx of American material not only bolstered British defenses but helped to sustain the broader Allied war effort. The United States had become the arsenal of democracy, and Britain, though weakened, was firmly part of this new alliance. Yet, for all the gratitude Britain felt for the aid, there was an undeniable sense of unease. The country's survival was now intrinsically tied to the will of the United States. As Britain's war efforts evolved from sheer endurance to strategic counteroffensive, it was clear that the Lend-Lease deal had not only strengthened the military alliance between the two countries, but had also marked the beginning of a new political reality, one in which Britain would no longer be the dominant power it had once been. The consequences of the Lend-Lease deal were not felt solely on the battlefield. The home front in Britain, already enduring the hardships of a prolonged war, was strained to the breaking point as the country's reliance on the United States deepened. Civilian life was a constant reminder of the war's toll: rationing, bombings, and the absence of so many young men sent to fight. With the influx of American supplies and aid, the British economy had to adapt to a new reality. While the immediate benefit of military equipment provided a much-needed morale boost, the cost of these materials, especially the financial debt, would weigh heavily on the national psyche for years to come. The wartime economy, already under pressure from the demands of global conflict, had to redirect its focus to accommodate the provisions arriving from across the Atlantic. The British government's finances were stretched thin, as the cost of warfare escalated and the expense of repaying the Lend-Lease debt loomed large. While the United States was in a position to afford these supplies, Britain's finances were rapidly depleted, and the threat of economic collapse was very real. Despite the strategic benefits of the deal, Britain's financial position worsened. The public, already burdened by the war's hardships, would eventually feel the ramifications of the deal, which added a long-term strain to an already fragile post-war economy. The idea of debt repayment became a source of national anxiety, as many feared that the cost of the war would leave Britain unable to rebuild after it had finally ended. In the heart of Britain's cities, life was defined by constant adjustment. Rationing continued, food remained scarce, and the specter of bombing raids hung over the population. The psychological strain on the civilian population was immense. For many families, the cost of war was not just measured in soldiers lost or cities bombed, but in the disruption to daily life. The arrival of American materials was seen as a lifeline, but the realities of the war continued to take their toll. The very supplies that were vital to Britain's survival were also reminders of the country's weakened state. As the British government relied more heavily on American resources, the public began to understand that the war effort was no longer solely a British endeavor. It was a shared effort, but one that was clearly dominated by the United States. Yet, for all the hardship and sacrifice, there was a sense of unity on the home front. The British people were resolute, committed to seeing the war through. The Lend-Lease deal, for many, represented a powerful example of the alliance between Britain and the United States, two nations standing together in their common cause. This alliance provided hope and strength to the civilian population. But there was also an undercurrent of anxiety, the knowledge that Britain was no longer solely in control of its own fate. The constant inflow of American aid, while crucial, underscored the reality of Britain's reliance on the United States. This reliance would ultimately reshape Britain's post-war identity, as the nation would have to navigate its place in a world dominated by American power and influence. As the war progressed and the Lend-Lease Act continued to shape Britain's military strategy, the role of the British Empire became more complex. The British colonies, once central to Britain's global dominance, were increasingly sidelined in favor of the transatlantic alliance with the United States. The empire, already struggling under the pressures of war, found its relevance diminished in the face of growing American influence. While Britain's empire had once been a symbol of its strength, it now became clear that the future of the empire was uncertain. The United States, as the war's dominant economic and military power, had less interest in maintaining British colonial rule, and its support for decolonization was beginning to take shape. The Lend-Lease Act's terms, which included American access to British military bases around the world, further shifted the power dynamics within the empire. For Churchill, this was a particularly bitter realization. His vision of a strong, unified British Empire was becoming increasingly unfeasible in a world where the United States, not Britain, was the center of the global stage. The American demand for military bases in strategic locations, such as in the Caribbean and Africa, marked a new phase in British-American relations. Britain was forced to cede control over vital parts of its imperial infrastructure to the Americans, a move that symbolized the decline of the British Empire. Despite this, Britain continued to rely heavily on its empire for resources. Colonial territories, particularly in Africa and India, were integral to Britain's war effort, providing much-needed supplies, labor, and strategic locations. But as the war reached its peak, it became increasingly clear that the empire's future would no longer be solely in British hands. The Lend-Lease Act, while offering critical military assistance, had subtly altered the colonial landscape. As British territories began to grow restive under the pressures of war and rising nationalist movements, Britain found itself caught between maintaining control over its empire and navigating the new geopolitical realities of the post-war world. While Churchill worked tirelessly to preserve Britain's imperial interests, he could not deny the shifting tides of history. The war had irrevocably changed the nature of empire. The collapse of the British Empire was now inevitable, and with the United States as the dominant power, Britain's colonial ambitions were no longer sustainable. The Lend-Lease Act, in its quiet way, had accelerated this process. Britain had survived the war, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the post-war world would not be one where Britain could retain its former global status. The era of empire was drawing to a close, and a new chapter in world history was beginning to take shape. With the end of the war in sight, the price of victory was becoming clearer. Britain had succeeded in holding the line with the help of the United States, but the cost of that survival was staggering. The financial burden of the Lend-Lease deal, along with the crippling costs of wartime destruction, left Britain in a vulnerable position. The nation's debt to the United States was mounting, and the post-war economic recovery was already looking uncertain. Despite the victory over Nazi Germany and the Axis powers, Britain's position in the world was shifting, and the legacy of the Lend-Lease Act would shape the country's future for decades to come. The Lend-Lease deal had been instrumental in Britain's survival during the war, but it had come at the cost of the country's financial independence. By the end of the war, Britain was deeply indebted to the United States, and this debt would define Britain's post-war economic policy. As the war ended, the British economy struggled to recover, and the country found itself dependent on American loans and assistance to rebuild. The Lend-Lease deal, while providing the military support that had been vital to Britain's war effort, had also placed the nation in a precarious financial position. When the war came to an end in 1945, Britain was victorious but battered. The nation had survived the most devastating conflict in history, but it had done so at an immense cost, both in terms of lives lost and resources exhausted. The Lend-Lease Act, which had enabled Britain to endure and continue fighting, had now placed the nation in an untenable position. The post-war reckoning began, and it was clear that the era of British dominance had ended. The economic debt incurred through the Lend-Lease program would haunt Britain for years, and the political consequences were no less severe. By 1945, Britain's debt to the United States amounted to billions of dollars, money that would never be fully repaid. The financial strain was compounded by the destruction of cities, industries, and infrastructure during the war. The British economy, once the envy of the world, was now in tatters. There were hopes for a swift recovery, but those hopes were tempered by the realization that Britain could not rebuild alone. The United States, having emerged from the war as the dominant global power, was now the primary source of financial and material support. The British government sought loans from the Americans, but these loans came with conditions. The U.S. was demanding more influence in Britain's foreign policy, particularly in regard to its empire and international alliances. The price of victory, it seemed, was an increasingly dependent relationship with the United States. In addition to the financial burden, Britain faced the harsh reality of its shrinking empire. The colonies, once the backbone of British power, were now seeking independence. India, which had been the jewel in Britain's imperial crown, gained independence in 1947. Other colonies followed suit, and the British Empire began to disintegrate at an alarming rate. The loss of these colonies was a bitter blow to Britain's national identity. Churchill, who had spent his career defending the empire, was forced to reckon with the fact that it was no longer tenable. The Lend-Lease Act, while it had kept Britain in the war, had also indirectly hastened the end of the empire. The cost of maintaining imperial control was no longer affordable, and as the Cold War began to take shape, Britain found itself relegated to the role of a secondary power, with its influence on the world stage waning. This post-war shift also brought with it a significant political realignment. The United States, as the unquestioned superpower, began to shape the international order, while Britain, once the architect of global diplomacy, was increasingly sidelined. The United States assumed a leadership role in the establishment of international institutions, such as the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund, while Britain, despite its historic contributions, was now playing a more passive role in global governance. The Lend-Lease Act had been a critical lifeline, but it had come with the unspoken cost of subordinating Britain to the will of a rising superpower. As the Cold War began to take shape, the relationship between Britain and the United States would evolve into one of unequal partnership. One in which Britain, despite its historical significance, would no longer be at the center. As the decades passed, the true legacy of the Lend-Lease Act began to take shape. It was a complicated legacy, one that reflected both the survival of Britain and the profound changes in global power dynamics. The Lend-Lease deal had enabled Britain to keep fighting against the Axis powers, but it had also marked the beginning of a new world order, one in which the United States was the undisputed leader. Britain, while still a significant power, was no longer the center of the global stage. The Lend-Lease Act had been instrumental in ensuring the defeat of Nazi Germany, but it had also signaled the decline of the British Empire and the rise of American hegemony. In the immediate aftermath of the war, there was little public acknowledgement of the deal's full significance. The Lend-Lease Act had been a necessity for survival, but its longer-term implications were not fully understood. It wasn't until the 1950s and 1960s, as Britain's imperial possessions continued to dissolve, that the true extent of the shift in global power became apparent. The United States, with its unrivaled economic and military power, began to shape the international system according to its own interests. Britain, while maintaining a strong relationship with its American ally, found itself in a subordinate position. This shift was most evident in the realm of foreign policy. The Suez Crisis of 1956, in which Britain attempted to take military action to seize control of the Suez Canal, was a stark reminder that the era of British dominance was over. The United States, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, opposed the British intervention, forcing Britain to back down. This event marked a humiliating moment for Britain, as it became clear that the United States had the power to dictate the course of international affairs. Despite these challenges, the Lend-Lease Act did leave Britain with some lasting benefits. The military aid and resources provided during the war allowed Britain to maintain its fighting capacity long enough to contribute to the Allied victory. Additionally, the strategic partnership with the United States helped lay the groundwork for the post-war international order, including the establishment of NATO and the defense of Western Europe against the Soviet threat. For Britain, the Lend-Lease Act was not just a wartime necessity but also a stepping stone to a new era of collaboration with the United States. However, the cost of this collaboration was the erosion of Britain's former global power. The final years of the war and the immediate post-war period marked a dramatic shift in the global balance of power. The Lend-Lease Act had served as a temporary lifeline for Britain, enabling it to continue the fight against Nazi Germany. But as the war ended and the world began to rebuild, it became clear that the future of global leadership would no longer lie with Britain. The United States, having emerged victorious and unscathed, assumed its place as the preeminent world power. Britain, which had once been the undisputed leader of global affairs, now found itself in a secondary role, reliant on American aid and influence. The Lend-Lease Act had been the mechanism that allowed Britain to survive, but it also signaled the end of the era in which Britain could dictate the terms of international diplomacy. In the aftermath of the war, the United States took on a new role as the defender of democracy and the leader of the Western world. The Marshall Plan, which followed the Lend-Lease Act, was designed to provide economic assistance to war-torn Europe, further cementing the United States' position as the dominant economic and military power. The United States was now the leading force in the creation of new international institutions such as the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Britain, though still influential, was increasingly sidelined in favor of American leadership. The shift in global power was most evident during the Cold War, as the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two superpowers vying for global influence. The Lend-Lease Act had been part of a broader strategy to unite the Western powers against the threat of Nazi Germany, but the post-war period saw the emergence of a new ideological divide. The United States, with its capitalist democratic model, stood in opposition to the Soviet Union's communist system. Britain, despite its strong ties to the United States, found itself caught between these two competing superpowers. While it remained a key player in NATO and the Western Alliance, it was no longer the dominant force it had once been. The United States had assumed leadership, and Britain's role was relegated to that of a secondary power. As Britain emerged from the war, it was clear that the economic burden of the conflict would be felt for many years to come. The country was deeply indebted to the United States, and this debt would shape British economic policy for the next several decades. The financial strain was compounded by the destruction of key infrastructure and the disruption of trade networks during the war. The Lend-Lease Act, while providing crucial military aid, had also come at a high economic cost. Britain's post-war recovery would require significant foreign loans, most of which would come from the United States. The national debt, combined with the financial obligations arising from the war, left Britain in a precarious economic position. The immediate post-war years were characterized by austerity and rationing. The British government, under the leadership of Clement Attlee, focused on rebuilding the country's infrastructure and economy. The Lend-Lease Act had helped Britain survive the war, but the financial consequences were profound. The need for foreign loans and economic assistance was acute, and Britain's reliance on the United States for financial support was now firmly entrenched. The United States, in turn, used its financial leverage to influence British economic policies, further solidifying its dominant position in the global economy. Despite these challenges, the post-war period also saw the establishment of the welfare state in Britain. The creation of the National Health Service, NHS, and the expansion of social programs were among the most significant reforms of the period. These initiatives, though costly, were seen as essential for rebuilding Britain's social fabric and ensuring the country's long-term prosperity. However, the economic costs of these reforms were high, and the burden of debt from the war continued to weigh on the British economy. In 1956, the Suez Crisis marked the final humiliation for Britain, signaling the complete collapse of its imperial ambitions. The crisis was sparked by Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal, a vital waterway that had been under British and French control. Britain, alongside France and Israel, launched a military intervention to retake the canal, but the United States, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, refused to support the military action. The United States, in an effort to prevent further escalation and maintain its influence in the Middle East, pressured Britain to cease its military operations. The outcome was a diplomatic disaster for Britain, which was forced to retreat in the face of American opposition. The Suez Crisis exposed the extent to which Britain had become dependent on the United States. The days of British imperial dominance were over, and the country's ability to act independently on the global stage had been severely curtailed. The crisis highlighted the reality that Britain's post-war survival and influence now rested firmly in the hands of the United States. The Lend-Lease Act, which had ensured Britain's survival during the war, had also helped to establish a new global order in which Britain's role was diminished. The Suez Crisis was the final blow to Britain's imperial ambitions, and it marked the definitive end of an era. The legacy of the Lend-Lease Act and the secret deal Churchill made to keep Britain fighting is complex and multifaceted. On one hand, the deal was a lifeline for Britain, enabling the country to continue the fight against Nazi Germany and ultimately contribute to the defeat of the Axis powers. The military aid provided by the United States, along with the strategic partnership forged between Roosevelt and Churchill, helped secure victory in Europe and the Pacific. However, the long-term consequences of the deal were far-reaching. The Lend-Lease Act marked the beginning of the end for Britain's imperial dominance and signaled the rise of the United States as the world's leading superpower. While Britain survived the war, its post-war future was fundamentally altered by the deal. The economic burden of the war, combined with the financial obligations of the Lend-Lease Act, left Britain in a vulnerable position. The country's dependence on the United States for military and economic support became a defining feature of the post-war world. Britain's imperial ambitions began to fade, as the country found itself increasingly sidelined by the United States in global affairs. The Lend-Lease Act, while instrumental in ensuring Britain's survival, also marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the United States would take center stage on the world stage, and Britain would have to navigate its role in a changing international order. The deal Churchill made to keep Britain fighting ultimately ensured the survival of the nation in its darkest hour. But it also marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which Britain's place in the world would be fundamentally reshaped. As the years passed and the United States assumed its leadership role in the global order, the impact of the Lend-Lease deal became increasingly evident. The price of survival was high, and Britain would carry the consequences of that secret deal for decades to come. The deal had kept Britain in the fight, but it also set the stage for a new world order in which the United States would be the dominant force, and Britain would find itself, for the first time in centuries, a secondary power on the world stage.